Okay. Great, we're now live. Hi, welcome everyone. This is a Chica Nation special feature. I'm here interviewing Bryan Parras and Tane Ward. Bryan is with TEJAS out of Houston, Texas, and Tane Ward is with Equilibrio Norte out of Austin, Texas, and both are warriors in the ground doing work around environmental justice, around community issues, decolonization. So I'd like to welcome you to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Great. Bryan, could you tell us a little more about yourself and about what TEJAS does?
Absolutely. First, thanks for having us on and bringing us together. I am a fan of Chica Nation and the Chicana Chronicles as well. Really happy to see all of the work that you've been helping put together and push out. We need more media folks in our communities. But I grew up in Houston, and I live on the east side of Houston, which is, you know, a particular side of the city where we have a large concentration of petrochemical plants and refineries. And there are many other cities, you know, like this, Corpus Christi, Port Arthur, and then other places along the coast, and we're seeing more and more develop. But I started organizing in this community with my dad in the late 90s, right after I got out of college. And we started focusing on environmental justice issues, which was sort of a new framework for looking at some of the disproportionate impacts that communities were being bombarded with, you know, across the country and the globe. And at the same time, I started organizing with another organization called Nuestra Palabra, focusing on Latino literature, quote unquote. And I think, you know, working on these two together sort of helped bridge what you said earlier, which was, you know, a decolonial perspective and decolonization, and really helped launch, you know, my early adulthood into that area in ways I had no idea were even happening, you know, at the time. But that's just, you know, very brief description. We can talk more as we get on into the interview.
Great. Well, thank you and welcome. Tane, could you tell us a little more about yourself and about Equilibrio Norte out there in Austin?
Sure thing. Well, thank you so much for having me here with you in this beautiful project. I'm here in Austin, Texas. And I organize through Equilibrio with my wife, Rocky Gonzalez, and my sister-in-law, Anita Gonzalez, my brother-in-law, Emerson Nez. And it's a decolonial organizing project. So, you know, it's decolonial in that it is holistically not driven as specifically a political, economic, spiritual, or cultural project, but it's all of those things. And it really is about the way in which people connect with each other and connect with the land in a way that is, you know, cosmologically rooted in indigenous practices. And we do that through community organizing, through spiritual work, and through cultural arts as well. So, you know, we've been doing this type of work. I myself have been working with indigenous communities to protect their lands from unwanted forms of development since 2003, and have worked extensively throughout South America as well as North America on these types of projects. And now with the Dakota Access Pipeline, you know, it seems like this is the thing that everybody's doing. So it's really fantastic to, you know, be able to be part of this larger movement that is emerging throughout the country and here in Texas as well.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that and welcome to it. So let's talk about Texas and these pipelines. We can take, I'd like to get each of your perspectives on it. What's the connection? What's happening in Standing Rock? What do folks need to know? And these pipelines and NoDAPL and what's happening up north.
Do you want to stay in the same order, or do you have a preference of who goes first? Well, let me start by just saying that I think that it's important to remember that this isn't the first pipeline, and this isn't the first indigenous struggle in the U.S. And that we've all had to do a lot of learning and soul searching in this work. And I can speak a little bit about Houston and how I sort of got connected into not just this pipeline fight, but another one that was in the American psyche prior to this, which is the KXL fight. And that sort of came on to my radar after another environmental disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. And I was fortunate enough to connect with two indigenous leaders from Canada. Actually, three indigenous leaders from Canada. Melina Lubacan Massimo, Clayton Thomas Mueller, and Jasmine Thomas, who happened to be at a gathering that I was at in London, targeting the same company, BP. And it was really not until then that I understood, this vast infrastructure that connects all of our communities together. We had done a lot of work focusing on, these sort of point source polluters, the refineries, these physical apparatus and mega structures that you see, where you can literally, see the smoke coming out 24/7. And we had talked about, the infrastructure underneath the city, because we knew that there were, ways that these chemicals and products were being shipped from industry to industry and then put on ships, put on trucks, and so on. But to imagine a pipeline coming from Canada in Alberta all the way down to Texas, had never really crossed my mind. And so, learning about that really, I think, changed the whole structure of how we think about extractive industries and how we look at fossil fuel industry, and the connectedness that we all share through these very destructive processes. And so, again, this particular pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, is making its way to the Gulf Coast. And this is something that we had to realize and learn, which is that many of the refineries that exist in the U.S. are concentrated along the Gulf Coast. There are other pockets of refineries and chemical plants, no doubt, in other parts of the country. But regionally, the Gulf Coast is by far the largest producer of oil and gas and chemical products. And so that is something that we started to see, and certainly with these pipelines that have been in the news the last 10 years, they're making their way to the Gulf Coast, because we have the capacity to process all of this oil and gas, and they want it. We're also in an area where it can be exported to other parts of the world, and so for that reason, it's also a very, very sought after location. And we're in a cluster of red states, which are really pro-industry, anti-regulation, and easier to work with, if you're a pipeline company, if you're a fossil fuel producer, and that is something that we never had the capacity really to work on. We're a very small organization, and so it was overwhelming, to think about the need for someone to be talking about these things and organizing around them. But that was one thing, you know, to actually fight it was you know, beyond our capacity. And yet, you know, it really only takes a handful of people to inspire a movement. You know, this Standing Rock, I don't want to call it a fight, you know, it's much bigger than that. Um, but, you know, a lot of this started with a very small group of people, you know, students, young folks that were running to raise awareness. Um, Several women who decided to take a stand to protect some sacred sites and burial grounds, and it grew from there. And so, you know, we've seen this time and time again in many different movements and areas. And I think the proliferation of social media and getting real grassroots voices out to the world has helped, you know, move that forward. And so, you know, that's been our connection. I live in Houston, which is also a hub for oil and gas industry headquarters, you know. And so for that reason, we've made a lot of contacts internationally with people fighting these companies in different parts of the world. We've been to shareholder meetings and different styles of, you know, trying to confront power here in the city. And you know, it's very often the case that when you see an accident or headline news of some fossil fuel industry butting up against a low-income community of color, they're often based out of Houston. And so that's been our sort of drive here, to not just think about the communities who live adjacent to these refineries and chemical plants, but also to think about the larger, you know, from the extraction and exploration phase of this industry all the way, you know, the transportation of it, and then to the production of it, and then where does it go, you know, and then how is it disposed of, the waste, you know, all of this, the whole entire cycle. And that's been, you know, sort of how I think these pipelines and these pipeline fights have really brought, you know, larger communities together.
Great, thank you. Tane, what are your thoughts on the connections between this and Texas?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, Brian's absolutely right. You know, the oil is coming down here, and the refineries in Texas are, you know, the economic engine of this country. The wealth that is produced materially in this country doesn't come from, you know, Wall Street. Goldman Sachs has no product. You know, the riches are coming out of Texas. This is, you know, the 1% gets their money through this process. And so, you know, the importance of oil and where it, you know, as Brian's describing, where it comes from, where it goes to, and how this all functions is extremely important to understanding economics in the United States. And I think that idea is emerging, which is important. It's also important to understand that, you know, Energy Transfer Partners, the majority stakeholder company in the Dakota Access Pipeline, is a Texas-based company. Kelsey Warren, the CEO, lives in Dallas, Texas. He is recently named a park after his son there. He is a billionaire, and he was recently also appointed to serve on the Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission by Governor Greg Abbott, someone who he gave over $2 million to in the last election cycle, which is information which has emerged recently. So, you know, it's a really good description of why and how politics is corrupt in a place like Texas. And then you also have to understand Kelsey Warren gave millions to the Trump campaign. So, you know, how favors are done for each other in that 1% game, you know, really is well described through the connections between Texas and DAPL. You know, apart from that, the Energy Transfer Partner is building other pipelines. They're building 2 other pipelines in West Texas, the Trans-Pecos Pipeline and the Comanche Trails Pipeline. Now, this is another side of the issue here because there's much resistance going on to these pipelines as well, and I'd like to talk about that in a minute. But what's important about these is that they're similar to the Dakota Access Pipeline. They were done by having permits for only small parts of the projects done at a time, so the entire economic and environmental impact of the project was never properly assessed by the Army Corps of Engineers, which is what these large neoliberal projects often do. Also, the Trans-Pecos Pipeline was estimated to destroy at least one archaeological site every mile of its construction. And it goes through the Big Bend area, which is the largest pristine area in Texas. The Comanche Trails pipeline goes through Xicanx, which is probably the most long-standing and beautiful archaeological zone in Texas, outside of El Paso. And so both of these threatened archaeological sites, they're also both for export, just as Bryan is describing, is this DAPL. And also when we're thinking about the similarities here, if you go to Eagle Pass, Texas, where the largest native resistance march in Texas happened earlier this year, you'll find that there's a coal mine also which threatens indigenous people's sacred site, and that's also for export. And if you go to South Padre Island, which is the last clean beach in Texas, it's recently emerged that the site where they were trying to build liquefied natural gas export terminals, there is burials there as well. So there's burials all in these places which are being threatened. All of these development projects are threatening parts of Texas which have not yet been destroyed, which is rare down here. They're all for exports, and it really shows you, the far end of what our political economy looks like in this country, exploiting the last few pristine areas, destroying ancient burial sites and sacred sites for Native peoples, all for exporting our natural resources to enrich an already billionaire, very corrupt corporate entity CEO, and and all of that. So that's the main way in which there's a connection between Dakota Access and Texas. There's also what's so beautiful about it, however, is that as I mentioned, in Eagle Pass in April there was the largest political gathering of natives in Texas, and this was something that was going on, through prayer, which has been happening for many, many years amongst Native peoples here. And afterwards, we realized that at the same time that was going on, there had been recently the largest gathering of tribes in the Pacific Northwest, resisting export terminals there. And then later on, we realized that Dakota Access was happening, and it became the largest Native struggle happening ever in the country. So we feel like this is actually part of a very organic movement that is emerging. It is unfolding before us, and it's really wonderful right now to be organizing where we can say, hey, this is Native-led, this is prayer-led. There's something greater happening here, and when we're doing our political action of all sorts, to be able to call in that prayer is really beautiful. So we're really happy to be able to have that strength as we're organizing against all of this that's happening in South Texas and West Texas as well.
Great, thank you. And I actually would love to get back to the topic about Texas, regards to the awakening that's happening, the gathering of nations there. But real quick, what can folks, this is our next question, what can folks in Texas do to take a stand? Bryan. Oh, I think you're muted here.
Is that better?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. There's a lot. There's a lot that people can do, and you don't have to go to Standing Rock. I think we've all, felt the calling. I have many sleepless nights thinking about what I could be doing, what I should be doing to help folks up at Standing Rock, and if you can, you should definitely answer that call. But there are, local fights, regional fights, and fights right here in the state of Texas, many of which Tane just mentioned, that people can join the cause. And I think first and foremost, people need to really challenge themselves to get into this prayerful moment that's happening, this spiritual movement that is really coming into these movements, the environmental movement, but also, many other sort of areas, education. We've seen a lot of people talking about decolonization in other communities too, and we've seen revolutions, in the last years in the Middle East. Something is happening globally, and we even saw it in Latin America 10, 15 years ago. There's something happening globally, this shift, and it has coincidentally or intentionally happened right at the same time that many of our elders have, spoken of, have said that it will happen at this time. We're at a 500-year anniversary, a time of change. Many ancient communities have talked about, an opportunity that we are living in, and we know, from our own sort of experience from Mesoamerican communities, how we live in cycles. We understand circles. We created the zero, right? We knew about the zero, and so I think, there's a calmness about our work, and we are patient people, but what we've seen is that time has sort of sped up, and the urgency of what needs to happen is really made this intense. Right now, there's crazy fires going on in Tennessee and in the South. I don't have to list all of the environmental, severe weather situations that have happened just in the last decade in my lifetime, but they are new, and it's not that they're just being covered more readily. These are really, really extreme weather phenomenon that are taking place, and these fights are connected to that. And I think what the indigenous communities have brought to the rest of the world is, this recognition that the health of the planet is directly related to the health of our own being. And that's why, we pray to the earth. That's why we pray to nature. That's why we pray to the sun, to the moon, and why we hold, all of creation sacred. And it's all important for us to look after. And, folks can look at this fight at Standing Rock as just, a very small part of the country, a very small part of the river. But again, this is all connected. That water does come downstream, so wherever you can fight, it's important to do so. There are many actions coming up that you can be a part of, and it's easy for me to say I know because I grew up with the internet and social media, and I know how to navigate through these systems readily, easily, but there are folks who don't. And so I know that it's easy for me to say this, but just look online, do some basic searches, and get on to the right hashtags on Twitter and Facebook, and find out what's happening. And if you can't do that, then organize in your own community. There have been a number of calls for solidarity, and again, Tane mentioned 3 fights here in Texas. find out where you live, what's going on in your area, be more conscious about what is happening there. You know, where does your water come from? Where does your food come from? And look at your air quality. You know, start there. Start there, and then ask a lot of questions and get involved. Look at the health of your community, and not just the physical health. You know, the psychological health and the educational aspirations of your children. You know, all of these things are related, and there's a need for all of us to organize. I know that there are areas of the state that are neglected, but it takes people in those communities, you know, standing up first, because we can't all be everywhere, and it's not right for anyone to go to another place and tell them what they need. Right? We need to be vigilant about what our needs are, and we need to be honest and fair about those needs. And so what we can do is hand you a list of actions that are coming up, and you know, look at where your money's invested. You know, that's important. That's something that folks have talked about in many different movements. There's alignment there. And then also think about your vulnerable communities, you know, not just yourself, but also, you know, notice the communities that you live in. Who are the invisible people in those communities, and how can you help them? You know, start from the ground and work your way up. And that's about all I can say. You know, it's the easiest thing for me, you know, generally speaking. There's, again, specific events and protests and fights that will be coming up, but we'll share that with you.
Great, thank you. Tane, what are your thoughts on what folks in Texas can do?
Well, you know, this is all great advice from Bryan. You know, I think that one of the things that's really important is not to despair and be very hopeful right now. Find what gives you hope. Many people really felt scared after the election of Donald Trump, and there was a sense of, you know, sort of fear around his presidency and everything that he represents. And, you know, our ancestors don't want us to be scared right now. I mean, fear is what won that election. Fear is really the enemy. I think right now is an important moment to realize that there is no greater power to appeal to within the state. There's no one looking out for you. There's no party, Democratic Party, or anyone who's in charge who's going to come and write some good policy rules that are going to save it. The power that we need to appeal to is our own power. People need to begin organizing in ways that they get to decide what happens to their lands. And whether, you know, you can go to Standing Rock, you know, there's an open call out to go. So if you can go, go. And, you know, if you can send goods or raise money, you put on a concert, you know, do a bake sale, whatever you can to raise money to you know, goods to send up there, you know, you can do that too, of course. But I know if you want to divest your money, there's a big divestment against Wells Fargo happening, and, you know, this all potentially impacts the Energy Transfer Partners and what have you. But, you know, more to, you know, Bryan's other point, you know, organizing your people and recognizing that, you know, in a colonial society, someone else is deciding what happens to your land. What happens to the land here in Texas? Is that up to you and your people, or is it up to some rich billionaire who wants to put a pipeline in? Who gets to say what happens to the last clean beach in Texas? Is that an energy company that wants to export gas to Japan? Or is that the people who live in Brownsville? What happens to Big Bend? Is that going to be the people of Trans-Pecos, or is that going to be decided by this billionaire in Dallas? What happens to, you know, in Xicanx? Is that going to be decided by the people of El Paso, or again this same company? And you know, what happens in your own communities? You know, there's miniature pipelines happening everywhere. I mean, both literally and figuratively. You know, there's more miles of pipeline in Texas than there are miles of road. There's, you know, and we can send you a map of the pipelines in the country, and you can't even see Louisiana and Texas on there. But moreover, there's you know, the same type of exploitative development is happening everywhere. And we're seeing that through the gentrification, which is happening throughout, well, East Austin, but also I'm sure every city has, barrios and, areas that are being, gentrified. And it's essentially the same political equation that we have up in Standing Rock or wherever, where someone else is making decisions about what's happening in the lives of communities and peoples who have been exploited by these systems. And, it's really the moment in time where, not to be passive around these things, but to organize and stand up and make the connections. There's also a really great moment here to do that work with that prayer, and behind that prayer that's coming from Standing Rock, and it's coming from the Native peoples of Texas as well. And that we're all invited into this prayer. We're all invited to be hopeful, look to a better future where it's not guided by corruption and exploitation, and that we can find a way to live better with each other and with the earth.
Thank you. And on that note, I would like to talk about this moment that we are having as, and I say we, meaning like the greater Mexicano, Chicano, Mexican American, indigenous community, how this moment is tied to our decolonization, but also how Texas is unique, and the environment in Texas is lending itself to play a critical role, both on the positive and on the negative side of this issue. Bryan, could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, it's important for folks to remember that the Gulf Coast, Mexico, the Caribbean were the first parts of this continent to be colonized, and there's a long history of that goes along with that. It's made this region unique because in Texas specifically, if you ask folks, there's overriding assumption that there are no indigenous people that live here, and that because there is a country called Mexico, and because it was conquered by Spain, that we are all Spanish, and that we have no indigenous roots, and that we have no connection to our indigenous culture, and that we have no, spiritual practices that we've maintained, and that we don't have a language. All of these things, which we know are all false, and yet we have, at the same time, within our own selves, a long history of suppressing all of this, and having to do that, simply to survive. And so even within our own communities, we have this same belief and assumption. And yet, somehow it's managed to survive within us despite ourselves and despite external forces, and again is surfacing right now in a very beautiful way that has scared a lot of people, has confused a lot of people, and is really causing a lot of our own communities to question, their own identities and look for answers. And this is, sort of something that has been particularly, difficult for Chicanos, because we are such a part of American culture, and always have been. And yet, we also recognize that there is a distinct, perception of what a Indian is, and what they look like, and how they act, and how they dress. And we have, sort of lost our fights for land. Our treaties are forgotten and lost, you know, in the records. We have no reservations. Last I checked, you know, there were no Chicano reservations. But we have always lived, you know, within all of our indigenous relatives' communities, just as we've always lived in our European communities, colonized communities. Some of us were forced, some of us were stolen and orphaned, and some of us chose, you know, to make that that transition on their own terms. And so the difficulty now, I think, is looking at these fights in West Texas and understanding and knowing that these are our ancestral lands, and the rest of the world recognizing that in the same way that they recognize, you know, the fight that's happening in North and South Dakota, up in Canada with the First Nation peoples, and that's something that's going to take some time, I think, you know, but that's what we're working on, and it's a beautiful process. I think it's beautiful, and it's you know, making us stronger people as a result. So, you know, there are many tribes that are organizing and bringing in all of their lost children, and we're growing, and we're being more accepted, and we're becoming more comfortable, you know, and it's being more accepted, you know, I think, publicly. And our real task is to not cheat that process, you know, to not take advantage of that process, and to understand the sacrifices that you know, the communities that have been historically identified as Native Americans, who were systematically, you know, discriminated against and killed and murdered and raped, that they also have their process, and neither of ours is any worse and should take away from the other, but that we should come together, and I can't wait to take that Chicano flag up to Standing Rock. I don't know if they have one yet, but also to invite them down to Texas, you know. And I think if you talk to folks, indigenous folks, they know how brutal Texas was, and continues to be. And so, you know, that's I think where I'm at, and I've sort of seen that echoed with my friends and other Chicanos that grew up here in the Southwest, you know, in the entire Southwest.
Thank you. Tane, what are your thoughts on that, on Texas and its place within this moment of awakening and decolonization?
Well, you know, I agree that, you know, it's a really important place. You know, from an archaeological perspective, Texas is the oldest human inhabited area in North America. There has been indigenous people for tens of thousands of years throughout Texas. Also one of the first areas of North America to experience colonization. Also successive waves of colonization, including, you know, having been a part of 5 different colonial nations, as well as having indigenous peoples moved into, across, through, out of, and into these lands. So, you know, the thing about colonialism is that different peoples are affected by colonialism in different ways. And so then they start getting pitted against each other, as Bryan's describing. But that doesn't mean that we're not Native, and then it doesn't mean that, you know, we haven't experienced some form of colonialism. And so what we have here is all of the there's 3 reservations in Texas. Tigua in West Texas, and Iquiquipú in South Texas, and Alabama Coshada in East Texas. But none of those tribes are actually from Texas. They were all moved from other parts of the country. Whereas the native peoples who are from Texas and have reservations, they have reservations in other states, either in New Mexico or in Oklahoma, and including the Tonkawa and Apache, Comanche folks. There are, however, many thousands of indigenous peoples throughout, especially South Texas and West Texas, including Coitecans, Carrizos, Apaches, and what have you, and obviously many people who identify now as Chicano, that have never been recognized by the state as having any sort of claim to the land. They're assumed to and spoken to as if though they come from somewhere else, i.e. Mexico. They're identified as Mexicans. But that's only because in 1938, the then president of Texas, Muriby Lamar, had an open policy of genocide against anyone who identified as a native, as an Indian. And so that's why all mission Indians, people who had understood laws but were identified politically as being indigenous, they all converted essentially politically to being Mexican at the foundation of Texas. That's many people who are now consider themselves maybe Chicanos or Latinos, or just to consider Mexican American. These types of folks don't understand that they have these long, beautiful, cultural roots. However, this cultural revitalization is happening right now, and it's a very important movement, I think, precisely because there's this sort of crisis within Western modernity where this absolutely material existence and individuals and capitalism and all of this stuff is not really working for people, and they're wondering what's happening. And I think what happens is that colonialism creates this dichotomy. Well, if you're not an Indian, then you must be whatever else is on the other side of this, a modern Western subject. And therefore, well, Indians care about the land, or they have a special connection to the land. So if you're not an Indian, then you don't have a special connection to the land, which is most people that therefore don't. Or Indians care about water, or Indians are spiritual, or Indians are all of these, racist, stereotypes we hear about Indians. But what we don't understand oftentimes is that the default position is therefore not having spirituality, not caring about the environment, not having a connection to the land, not having a clan system, not being able to, to do all these things that actually really are the answer and the response to this crisis that we're seeing throughout our country. And, oftentimes, we think of something like, the treaties that are not being honored in the Dakotas, and we wonder, what would it look like to make a new treaty with the people in the Dakotas? And people immediately go, well, why would any indigenous people believe anything the government had to say? They've only done anything but break treaties. And however, now is the time we could say, well, why would any settler colonial people believe in the government either? They're only protecting these corporations. And the whole system at that point that's divided people is starting to fall in on itself. And that's really why it's really a ripe moment for people to understand that, they have indigenous roots, or even if that they don't, they have some sort of roots that are beyond or deeper than, more meaningful than, the sort of individualist capitalist system that they're being fed, which is absolutely devoid of any real meaning or connection among people. And also, Texas is really important, I think, in this because it's what I call a hyper-colonial space. It produces colonialism through its Western imagining of freedom, cowboy culture, oil rigs, war presidents. All of these things are very white Western settler colonial identities that are produced out of Texas. They're synonymous with Texas. Texas also has the longest militarized border of anywhere in the world with Mexico, which it helps to produce the state and the division amongst peoples. Also, the economy that we've been talking about, the oil economy, is very colonial in upholding not only the U.S. but the world economy. And then this idea that there's no reservations, there's no recognized native peoples. It's a place where people have become very comfortable with this fiction that there are no native peoples in Texas. There's no native people left in Texas. Obviously, this is just a ridiculous, when you do look at the true history, the complex history, the beautiful history about how long there has really been native peoples in Texas, you see that there's a whole lot missing from that narrative. And, the Southwest extends to this place, but the Deep South also extends to this place, the Gulf. And, Mexico, very much cultural areas of northern Mexico extend to this place as well. And the Great Plains extend to this place. It's really this beautiful crossroads of many different cultures, many different native peoples, and unfortunately, many different overlapping aspects of colonialism, which have made it very difficult for people to navigate how or why, what they're connected to. They're taught that they want something simple. An Indian, as Bryan was saying, Indian is like this. There's a feather, there's a braid, there's a song, there's a tribe, there's a treaty signed at some point, and that's just not true for many native peoples all over the North and South America. One interesting way to think about it is this: there was Chicanos living in Texas 100 years before the Pilgrims landed in Standing Rock, in Plymouth Rock, rather. The first Indians to have horses was during the Pueblo Revolt of 1620. The Navajo stole horses from the Spanish. 100 years before that, there was Chicanos living in the Southwest before an Indian ever rode a horse. This is, one of our images of, oh, what do you think, who are the first peoples? And people think about that. They think of this Plains Indian on a horse. I mean, that didn't even exist till hundreds of years after there was literally Chicano peoples living in, essentially barrios in colonial cities in, the Southwest. So it kind of shifts your idea of what really does it mean to be native. I think this is also something that I just want to end on, is that, like, it's important to unify and be proud of who you are. And oftentimes people are like, well, I don't know who my grandparents, I don't know my great-grandparents, I don't know who they were, I don't know who they are. What about your great-grandchildren? Who are they going to be? This is equally as important. You may not know who your grandparents were, but you know who your grandchildren will be. They're people who will be connected to each other. They'll be connected to this land. They will protect this land. They will be connected to, you as their ancestor. And so, being native, begins in the present moment. It's not just about living in the past. It's about transcending time and living 7 generations back, but also 7 generations forward. And I think that's really important for me.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And on that note, we'll be closing out this interview. So last question, very quickly. Could you tell folks what events are coming, what they need to be looking out for in your area, or anywhere else that they need to go, or things they need to do? Oh, you're muted. Let's see. Let's see. We can't hear you, Bryan.
There you go. I think it was me. Is that better? Sorry. Yeah. So the upcoming event for us here in Houston is December 10th. We'll be joining the Society of Native Nations on a boycott of Wells Fargo. And that's a direct call from folks at Standing Rock to divest from the banks who are, funding these projects, who speculate on these projects with their dollars for future returns. And then after that, maybe we'll go after Chase. We'll keep you posted. But that's coming up. And if you want to learn more, please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services. On Twitter, we're Tejas Barrios. Online, our website is tejasbarrios.org, and we'll let you know when we have upcoming events.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tane?
Yeah. Well, it's been hard to keep up. There seems to be an action every day. There's actually an action tomorrow morning in Austin at Wells Fargo. We're participating all over the state in the day of divestment from Wells Fargo on December 10th as well. So those are big things that are coming up throughout the state. But to keep up with what's going on with the Trans-Pecos pipeline in West Texas, the Big Bend Conservation Alliance is a good source of information. We'll make sure that there's a link for you to share with people for the Comanche Trails Project out of El Paso. There's Earth Guardians El Paso that are organizing around that. Society of Native Nations is organizing a lot out of San Antonio. ATXEJ is organizing a lot out of Austin. They have a group specifically dedicated to all of this work. Society of Native Nations also is operating out of Dallas and Tejas and Houston. So wherever you're at, hopefully you can link up with some good folks who are doing good work.
Thank you. And I actually have 2 events that I'd also like to add to that. This weekend, there's a call for folks, for poets and artists from the greater Mexicanx community to put together floricantos as a form of not only resistance and expression, but also to build community, raise awareness about what's happening at Standing Rock and the issues that are also happening in our communities. So there's a call for a floricanto for folks to self-organize floricantos for that purpose. And also now there will be specifically for danzantes to go to Standing Rock and have a place to stay and connect. It's called the Ayoyotes On The Ground camp. Right now, the jefes, Elga and Jose Garza out of Albuquerque and formerly Texas, are leading that effort. And there's a GoFundMe that whose links I'll include at the bottom of this article so that folks can support in getting the supplies they need to set up camp. And then pretty soon we'll be launching a call for danzantes Mexico who would like to travel to hold space and put their bodies on the line and offer prayer of dance there at the Sacred Stone Camp. Wraps it up for today's interview. Thank you so much, Bryan and Tane, for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Good night.
Thank you. Buenas noches.
Thanks, Bryan.
Bye-bye.
Peace out.
Bye. Bye.